serious questions about isolation, inequality, and the unraveling of community bonds. So as the traditional family unit becomes less central, are our policies and safety nets keeping pace? And what kind of long-term vision is needed as this new normal reshapes the country's demographic and social landscape? For a deeper discussion on this, we connect to Kim Jo-eun, Associate Professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. A big welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Ji-sun Baek, Research Scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So for the first time, South Korea has actually officially entered the era of 8 million single-person households. So from a public policy perspective, Professor Kim, how could the shift reshape how we define family, community, and even social responsibility?
I think this shift really calls for a fundamental rethink of how we approach welfare in South Korea. For a long time, our system has been built on the assumption that families take care of each other, whether it means raising children or supporting aging parents. But in a society where living alone is becoming normalized, I think that assumption no longer holds. So which means that we need to move away from family-centered welfare model toward one that is more community and state-based. And this becomes especially clear when we look at housing policy. Most housing in Korea currently is still designed around the idea of nuclear family, typically parents with 2 kids, but that no longer reflects how people actually live today. So going forward, we need definitely smaller, affordable, and accessible housing options that are better suited to single-person household. And at the same time, this isn't just about building smaller units. It's about rethinking what housing means altogether. Housing needs to be redesigned as a part of broader support system, one that integrates community spaces and care services into everyday living. And of course, this is particularly important for older adults, which is why we need to expand senior-friendly, community-based housing models. And these models would allow people to live independently while still having access to
the latest changes we're seeing. Now, before we touch upon that, let's look into the details of the latest trend. So both older adults and young people are leading the latest trend. Ms. Baek, what demographic transitions are behind this growth, and how do the life conditions of these two main groups actually differ?
It is indeed a unique era where we are seeing more older people and more young people living alone at the same time. But they're at 2 different life stages. People are living longer, so naturally there are more older people living alone. For them, it is not usually a choice, it is a circumstance, and mostly the last stage of their life. Meanwhile, young people these days look for opportunities in competitive big cities and delay marriage. So there are more of them living alone. This is usually a choice driven by their careers and ambitions. And for them, this is mostly the start of their adulthood. But when you think about it, this isn't really unique to only South Korea. We see this phenomenon in other countries as well. For example, according to recent data, 36% of our households in South Korea live alone. In EU countries, it's almost the same, at around 37%. However, the major difference is the quality of life. In Korea, old people living alone are amongst the poorest elderly populations in the OECD. And for young people, they do not go through the typical transition that European young people do, which is often moving out, finding a partner, cohabiting, and then marrying. Because that cohabitation step is missing here, they might live alone for much longer, often with weaker support systems compared to their European counterparts.
So, as our Ms. Baek has just pointed out, when it comes to the financial aspect, many single-person households fall well below national income averages. What's fueling this structure gap, Professor Kim? Could you tell us? And what kinds of long-term risks does it actually pose for our society?
think the income gap that we are seeing between single-person household and a multi-people household is closely linked to changes in marriage and family formation pattern. So for young adults, marriage has increasingly become, we call it a luxury good. So it's no longer a life stage that most people naturally moved into, but something that is far more accessible to those who have everything: stable jobs, higher education, and financial security. So when people do marry, they definitely benefit from shared income, lower living costs, and emotional supports, and all these kind of benefits eventually growing creates greater advantage over time. So what's important to emphasize here is that living alone does not cause economic vulnerability. It's actually the reverse. Economic insecurity push many people to live alone, and because they cannot afford marriage or family formation, in this sense, living arrangements has become a visible marker of deeper economic inequality, with marriage increasingly separating those who have everything and those who have not. So you mentioned about this, what's the consequences for social stability? And obviously living alone can have consequences that go beyond individual well-being. Social isolation can weaken social trust, and some literature argue that it can even undermine democracy. So people who feel alone are and disconnected are more likely to be develop distrust towards society or become more drawn to extremist perspectives, so which in turn can increase the risk of long-term political stability, political instability.
Right. Very concerning situation we're seeing. Now, in fact, latest data released by the Korea Data Agency actually shows the average income of single-person household is just 46% of the national household average, and their assets are under 40% of the national average. Ms. Beck, what structural forces do you see behind this disparity, and what does it tell us demographically?
This data again proves that single-person households are often in vulnerable financial situations. For the elderly, this disparity reflects the fact that the poverty rate among older adults in South Korea is the highest in the OECD, as I mentioned before. For young people, this financial pressure actually hinders their independence. We expect young people to move out and look for better opportunities. But decent rent in Seoul mostly requires a deposit of over like 10 million won. I mean, who has that kind of money when you have just graduated from university? So they start their independent lives under huge financial pressure. This tells us that affordable housing is urgently required for these demographics.
Definitely. So it really underscores the financial divide this has brought. And housing, of course, is a major issue that needs to be tackled. But beyond income, the emotional and social costs are also mounting. Even nearly half of all single-person households say they feel lonely on a regular basis. Professor Kim, what broader social or structural factors are contributing to this level of disconnection?
So, I mean, first of all, many of the traditional sources of connection have weakened. In the past, people were embedded in families, neighborhoods, and long-term workplaces. But today, people move more often and live far away from their relatives and change jobs more frequently. So those stable everyday relationships are much harder to maintain nowadays. And then also technology plays an important role. We're constantly connected through phones and social media, but a lot of these interactions are shallow, and they can create a feeling of being connected without providing an actual emotional closeness that actually protects people against loneliness. And of course, there's also cultural factor. In Korea, living alone, especially for elderly, still carries some social stigma that can make people feel ashamed or hesitant to reach out to each other, which only deepens isolation.
So it's not just emotional, it has real social consequences moving forward. Now let's circle back to our one of their major causes, the major important topic, housing. So the latest data shows that housing issues add actually another layer to this. Nearly half of single-person households live in homes under 40 square meters. And a local study showed that many live in isolated housing like 고시원s or dorm-like units or aging low-income housing. Ms. Beck, what do these spatial patterns actually show us?
This reveals a clear divide. Young people often look for better opportunities in big cities, but to do so, they have to sacrifice space or quality of their life. Hence, they end up living in extremely small places like Goshi ones. But many of them have to choose these options simply because they cannot afford the expensive deposit for different housing options. So for them, maybe deposit support or alternative, but decent housing options where you can rent without a huge chunk of money would be incredibly helpful. On the other hand, older people often live in aging areas and run-down places. This shows that they are isolated from society and living in areas lacking proper infrastructure. For them, community-based support and rebuilding social networks are the priority. Here, I would also like to mention intersectionality. Amongst a single-person household, women experience distinct challenges. For my master thesis years ago, I studied life experiences of young women living alone, mostly in a very small studio. My study showed that simply the fact of living alone leads to significant fear and safety concerns for this young woman. This tells us that different age groups and genders need different tailored types of support.
Definitely. So the different age groups actually show a deeper social fragmentation. Professor Kim, do you see it as an evidence of a community breakdown? And if so, how do we begin to rebuild social cohesion in the new landscape?
I don't think the breakdown of social cohesion of community is the cause of what we are seeing. It's actually the result. So when we talk about rebuilding community, there's often an assumption that this is a cultural problem, that people somehow become more individualistic, selfish, and they stop caring about other people. I don't think that's true. People aren't living alone because they don't value connection. They're living alone because the conditions of their lives make other options very unfeasible. So the biggest driver here is the labor market. I would assume it's a precarious job, unstable income, long working hours, and rising living costs make it difficult to form families or maintain social connections. So when young people cannot afford to get married and when their workers are too exhausted to see friends, or if it's too expensive to dine out, that's not a failure of community values. It's a structural problem. So if we really want to address this loneliness and social disconnection issue, the solution isn't just about telling people to reconnect or creating more community events. Those things can help, but they do not fix the root problem. So we need to look at the economic structure itself and how to create stable job and how to give people more time and security. Without that, we are just treating the symptoms, not the root cause.
Definitely. So looking into the root causes and providing supportive policies on that would be very necessary. So like we've said, separate findings actually show that many living alone, especially the young, have far fewer people to turn to when they're sick, depressed, or in financial need. So from a demographic perspective, Ms. Beck, what does this weakening of support networks suggest about future social risks?
This might be actually a natural result if more young people are living alone for longer periods. They naturally lose that immediate support network. This links back to the topic I mentioned about the life course differences between young people in Korea and in Western countries. In the West, even though young people might start by living alone, they often move in together and share the rent once they find a partner. But in Korea, this step is often missing because we still believe you have to marry to live together. The problem is young people are delaying marriage because they don't have money or haven't secured a stable job yet. But because they are not married, they feel like they cannot live together and they cannot share the cost. So they're stuck living alone, paying full rent by themselves for a long time. This lack of companionship can lead not only to financial insecurity, but also to deep isolation.
Right, so social and cultural atmosphere is also playing a role on that. Now, when it comes to policies and, reactions to that, traditionally, public care systems in the nation have focused on the young and the elderly, but more and more middle-aged and younger adults living alone are falling through the cracks. Why is it so critical to extend care systems across the full adult life spectrum, Professor Kim?
I guess it's basically because the statistics say that there are a lot of people who are living alone, and these people tend to be atypical population, which are like young adults and middle-aged population. But I don't think, extending care programs to working age population is going to be okay. It's well intended, obviously, but in many ways, it's still treating the symptoms, not the root cause. So when we talk about caring for young adults, living alone, things like, I would say, mental health hotlines or community programs or other types of loneliness interventions, these are mostly reactive, right? So they step in after people are already isolated. So of course they need these kind of supports, but they don't really explain why so many young people or middle-aged populations are becoming isolated in the first place. So a deeper issue is, again, structural. So it comes back to the labor market. Young people in Korea work very long hours, often unstable jobs with little security. People are tired, stressed out, and burned out. So when they work, takes up much energy and there's little left for building relationships. So instead of meeting people, so many just go online, scroll down the screen and consume content, not because they prefer to do so, but because it's only energy they have, during their free time. So if the government is serious about reducing isolation among young adults, care policies alone is not going to be enough. So we also need labor market reform. This means that actually reinforcing reasonable working hours, creating more stable jobs. So individual care or loneliness intervention programs might be helpful, but it's not going to be enough.
Right, so a very important message that you've made, treating the symptoms, not the root cause. So now we have to really look into the cause of why people are so exhausted these days. Now, when we look ahead, so if single-person households are becoming the new normal, Ms. Beck, how do you expect this to reshape Korea's demographic landscape over the next decade or two, and how should policymakers be preparing for that?
First of all, I totally agree with Professor Kim. The number of single-person household will most likely only increase, in my opinion. For the elderly living alone, we need to think about two key points: care support and community building. Just helping them live longer is not enough anymore. We need to focus on how they are living. They deserve to live with dignity, proper support, and within a community. And for young people, if nothing changes, where job remains stable, unstable, rent is high, and cohabitation is still taboo, then living alone won't just be a short phase. It will become a long-term lifestyle. As young people stay single longer, they naturally may marry later, which leaves them with less time to have children. So we're not just looking at the low birth rate here, we're looking at a totally different family structure. So it would be actually ideal if we could find ways to help them shorten this period of living alone during such an important life stage. I would say, ironically, if there is a policy change that supports cohabiting couples without marriage, this could actually decrease the burden on young people living alone, as marriage wouldn't be their only option for companionship, and they could also share the cost of living.
Right, cohabiting policies. I'm already curious to see how that would adapt to the Korean society. But thank you so much for your opinion, Ms. Beck.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Kim, too. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
And